For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sophia. I'm the volunteer coordinator here at CJRU, and I'm also one of the hosts of tonight's workshop. Before we do get started, I just want to give a quick intro to all of the lovely CJRU staff who are hosting and also working behind the scenes with us tonight to put this all together. Alex, did you want to kick it off? Alex is our news director.
I would love to. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy and excited to electronically meet all of you. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. Yes, as Sophia said, I'm the news director at CJRU. I'm the producer and the host most of the time of our weekly news program, The Final Word, which airs on Fridays at 5 p.m. Listen if you are interested. And I'm also a freelance journalist on some of my free time. I'm also a fourth year journalism student in the undergraduate program at Ryerson. And yeah, once again, I'm very happy that all of you guys came out, and yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Alex. And we'll go next to Nama, the coordinator of Morning Mixtape.
Thank you, Sophia. Hi, everyone. I'm Nama. So I'm the coordinator for the morning newscast that airs 5 times a week. I'm also a third-year journalism student right here at Ryerson and love to do some freelance on the side. And yeah, just really looking forward to this workshop.
Thanks, Nama. And last but definitely not least, we'll go to Sam, CJRU's resident journalist and someone who's also participating in the local journalism initiative.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, nice to meet you all virtually as well. I'm a journalist with CJRU, and my work is funded through that grant, the local journalism initiative that's been placing journalists in stations across the country. So I'm in Toronto, and I've been covering things like tenant organizing, a lot of COVID, the housing crisis, food justice, those kind of topics. And I think it's worth mentioning for this kind of workshop that I never went to journalism school, and I just have transferable skills from working in music and having done a lot of anti-racism work in the past. So my view on journalism might be a little bit different since I'm coming at it from a pretty different angle. So I'm excited to share and just kind of discuss all of that with everyone here.
All right, so those are all of the hosts and our CJRU staff. To get started, before you begin reporting on any misrepresented community, you want to think, is it my place to be telling this story, or should I step back? And to help you figure that out, you want to ask yourself a couple of questions. First of all, am I just here for a byline? Am I okay with, can I admit that to myself? Am I just here for a portfolio piece, for something to put on my resume? If that's the case, you probably shouldn't be telling this story, because as you'll hear throughout the workshop, these are people's lived experiences. They're not just a news story or a feature or whatever it is that you're working on. You also want to consider your source as well. So are you okay with the fact that that person could face backlash just for speaking with you? With misrepresented communities, there are circumstances where your source could face some sort of isolation from the community or just any kind of backlash for just speaking with you, because the community has been so wronged by the media in the past. And it's important to know that when you're asking someone to make that sacrifice by speaking with you, you want to do their story justice. So make sure you're okay with asking someone to take that on for you as well. And the last question that I usually go through is, what am I willing to do to make this person feel safe and feel heard? If this person sent you an email in 3 months when the story is long past you, where would you be? What would you be thinking about? Would you ignore it, or would you get back to them and do what you can to help? You really want to think about the community, because like I said, it might just be a story for you, but these are things that people go through every day. I do have a quick personal note to share. So for a long time, I produced one of CJRU's podcast style radio shows. It's called Fem Radio, and it's an intersectional feminist radio show. And when I first started producing it, I was the only person on the team. So I was the producer, the host, the writer, the editor, everything. But what that meant is that an intersectional feminist podcast was being taken on by a cisgender, white, straight woman, which is something that is ethically a very gray area. And of course, it's an intersectional feminist podcast. I wanted to tell the stories of all women and all non-binary folks as well. in that situation, all I could really do was try my best to do justice to the communities that I was working with, to be in as good of a place as I could be to report on them as possible. And even while I was doing that, I was constantly thinking about who could tell the story better than I could, and making sure I took every step possible to bring in people with those different perspectives to take on the show. And I'm glad to say that they have now taken on the show, and Femme Radio has a great team with people from all different walks of life working on it now. So it did end up paying off. But in the meantime, that's sort of the process that I went through when debating if it was even a story that I should be telling, if I was the right person to talk about. Sort of on that note, we do have someone that we wanted you to hear from. So this is Kamal Al-Solalyee, and he is an RSJ prof for those of you who go to the Ryerson School of Journalism. He's someone that you may have had in your classes to teach you. He's a journalist and an author who has worked in 16 countries and communities across his time in the field, and he graciously sent us a 7-piece step for you, a 7-piece guide to how he approaches reporting in misrepresented communities. And I think that's a good intro. And then we'll touch on some of the things that he said as we move on in the workshop.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kamal Al-Solalyee, and I am a professor of journalism at Ryerson. Thank you for inviting me to your workshop on reporting on misrepresented communities. I've done a lot of reporting from different countries around the world, including what I would call misrepresented communities, whether that's the Muslim community, migrant workers, or deported people who have been deported back to their home country. And over the years, the last 10 years in particular, I've kind of established a very personal code of conduct that I'd like to share with you. And it's just quickly, I'm going to say it's made up of 7 things. 7 things that I'd like to do when I do that kind of reporting that you guys are exploring today. So the first thing is to try to establish contact with a trusted source within the community or country you're reporting from. Really, you need to find someone who is in a position of trust that can open doors for you. For me, this has always been an NGO or an academic who's doing research from that particular community. The second step is to ask them to connect you with people. Before you even arrive in that community, whether that community is a bus ride away or across the ocean, you before you travel, ask to be connected with people, establish that contact with people through WhatsApp, for example, or Facebook or social media. The third thing is once you've made that contact with 1 or 2 people and they clearly understand what you're trying to do, please ask them to introduce you to more people. You have to get a buy-in from the community you're reporting from. You cannot do the maverick thing. It'd be great if everyone actually wants you to succeed and wants you to get stories because they want you to tell their stories, or at least they want to tell their stories to somebody. Don't assume that everyone is as media savvy as you are. As we think we are anyway. Understand that what somebody tells you might get them in trouble. Please explain to them that their words might end up in a podcast or in print, and give them the option of not adding their name to their stories. Always do your research before you even start the interviews, and that's a given. But I do mean deep research in order to understand the complexities of the conflicts, the long histories of neglect and colonization that may have led them to be misrepresented in the media. 6, that doesn't mean, you do the research, but that doesn't mean you don't ask questions, of course, but always feel free to ask for clarification, for context. Even if you think you know it, it's a great idea to hear it straight from other people's mouth. Let them give you the story, not how you researched it probably in the media, but how it is very much a lived experience. Finally, what I've discovered over the years is that the relationship with your sources does not end when the interview or reporting trip end. On a very practical level, you'll always need clarifications or further questions or re-record an interview because the sound quality was bad. But on an ethical level, I think it builds trust for you and for future journalists. Every time you've done reporting from a misrepresented community the right way, you have added to the bank of trust between the media and that community. You, in effect, open doors for the next storyteller or the next generation who's going to come and tell a different story about that community.
All right, I hope that was helpful for all of you. And one thing that Kamal had asked me personally to mention on his behalf is that this is not the extent of his thoughts on this topic. This is just the beginning, and he really encourages all of you to take what he said and further it and look into it and really put into practice your own code of conduct as well. So on that note, I hope you've enjoyed hearing what Kamal has had to say. I hope it's got you thinking about some things that we are going to get into now, and I'll throw it over to Nama.
Thank you so much, Sophia. So the next thing we're going to talk about specifically is how do you report on a community that you are not a part of, which can be incredibly intimidating because naturally you don't have the same lived experiences that they do. You likely can't relate to a lot of the things that they go through. You likely can't relate to what they go through in the story that you're writing. So how do you go about reporting on that community with confidence? So honestly, there's a lot of things that you can do, but my favorite kind of code of ethics that I like to go for is if you don't know something, just ask. And I know it can feel intimidating, but it really is the best way to do it. There's no shame in not knowing something, but the only thing there is shame in really is in making assumptions about a community as a journalist. Really, if you don't know something, don't just assume and write a filler into your story. Don't generalize anything about a certain community, right? If you don't know how someone should be referred to, just ask them. If you don't know how a certain tradition really works, just ask them, regardless of how silly the question might be. Because I mean, in a certain sense, the sillier, quote unquote, sillier the question is, it probably is necessary that you ask it because it's probably a big concept that you need to get a grasp on. And it can feel awkward to ask these questions, but the truth is that people always appreciate it. And especially if you're not part of that community, they will appreciate the fact that you want to be educated on them, that you want to know more about them. And it'll really help build up trust as well as a journalist. And even while you're writing the piece, if you have any gaps and anything that seems incomplete, pick up the phone, ask follow-up questions. They really will appreciate the fact that you're trying to get the facts straight. They really will appreciate your desire to learn at the end of the day.
Just to add to that, I think for a lot of communities or initiatives that don't get much media coverage, the idea of speaking with journalists can be daunting, even if there is a level of trust with the media. And so sometimes what I do is I'll schedule pre-interview calls, not necessarily because there's things that I want to talk to before the interview, but more so just to get my source comfortable with me and understanding like what my vibe is and what the station is about, and just making it more comfortable when it does come time to record. So some things I'll do during those kind of calls or even at the start of our interviews is to just reassure them that they can restart questions since a lot of our work is pre-recorded right now. And that they can decline questions if it's outside the scope of what they do, things like that. And I think this kind of thing helps with any source, but in the context of a misrepresented community, I think it does carry a different weight. And so just thinking about that whole experience from outreach to recording and then what happens afterwards. And something I like to keep in mind as well is just that as a journalist, I think it's an honor to hear these stories and not my right or anything like that. And that kind of dictates that whole kind of experience that I'm building.
So we are hearing next from Katie Swyers, who is a former CJRU news director. She is now a CBC Donaldson Scholar, and Katie has worked with misrepresented communities on many occasions. She worked on the Tainted Water investigation, which focused on Indigenous communities, or the report that she did focused on Indigenous communities. She was also involved on a documentary called Trafficked, which worked with those who had been involved in sex trafficking in the past. So Katie's going to talk to us a bit about how to make sure that your source feels safe and what your boundary should really be.
The most important thing is to be compassionate, empathetic, and transparent. Remember that someone is a person first and a source second. Your story really shouldn't be more important than someone's trauma. It can be scary to talk to the media, so explain what the process is going to be like for them, why you're talking to them, how their answers will factor into your story, and especially when you're dealing with something sensitive that might have consequences for them, make sure you explain what those repercussions might be. People should be making an informed decision about speaking publicly. Don't just drop in, get what you need, and get out. Check in with your sources throughout the process. Consider going over their quotes with them before you publish to ensure that your reporting is fair and accurate. And do as much research as possible on the community before you start interviewing people. You should be thinking critically about how you're framing the story and make sure that you aren't relying on stereotypes or cliches. We all have our own implicit biases, and you need to be cognizant of that as you work. Don't be afraid to ask for an interview or ask a hard question. People are usually quite generous, but you should also be respectful and understanding if someone says no. Duncan McHugh and Connie Walker talk about this concept of being a storyteller versus a story taker, which I think is a really good mind frame to have while you work. You want these communities to retain their agency. And send your piece to your sources once you're done. People really appreciate it.
And now I'm going to talk a bit about something that relates to what Katie was talking about, and that's building trust with sources. Remember that sometimes you might be reporting on people who have just gone through a huge trauma. And it's okay for you to be human and compassionate in those circumstances. When you're reporting on those situations, it doesn't make you a bad reporter to tell someone you're sorry they had to experience that, or to pass on your condolences if someone has experienced a loss. It makes you human, and it doesn't make your piece less factually sound. It will just work to build that relationship with your source, and it will work to make them more comfortable with you. So it goes two ways, but I always feel that it's just better to be human than to be a robotic reporter because you want to get the story and get out. And I know, Sam, you actually have a message that you share with your interviewees before you talk to them.
Yeah, so I usually start off just saying like, yeah, we can restart all of that stuff. And then once I click record, I start off asking my source to pronounce their name. So I have it on recording, since I am going to have to say it because it's radio, but just also in general, just to be polite and pronounce their names correctly. And after that, I also ask for their pronouns. And so I do this even if I have seen like their past press, because sometimes people are misgendered, they use different pronouns now, or maybe they're trying out different pronouns. So those are some things I do just to kind of set the tone and just make the whole experience a bit more comfortable and continue building trust. So that's something I think has helped me, or has gotten a good response as I've been interviewing with people. So I just wanted to share.
So the next thing we're going to talk about is when someone's identity is important to mention in a story. So regardless of the story you are writing, you should always have a diverse set of sources for anything, right? But when do you point out someone's identity in a story? I bet you've read some stories before where it says, a Muslim man, black that, and you wonder like, why was that important? Like, what does that have to do with the story, right? There's so many cases where someone's identity is not too appropriate to include if it doesn't contribute anything. So before you include someone's identity in any way, whether it's their race, sexuality, gender identity, ask yourself the following questions. Would their story be any different if it weren't for their identity? Does their identity have literally anything to do with what is happening? If it doesn't, don't report it. For example, right, if a store, say it's a victim of a robbery, the identity of the store's owner or the cashier that was in charge likely doesn't have much to do with the story itself. But on the other hand, say someone was the victim of a hate crime and you're reporting that story. I mean, it's a given that their identity would be crucial to put in the story because it's obviously entrenched in the story itself. If it weren't for their identity, the story wouldn't have happened. Their identity contributed to the story in a way that you can't skip on. So really make sure, again, you should always have a diverse set of sources, regardless of whether or not you point out their identity in the story. But it's really important to have that moment of self-reflection of saying, Is this important? Does this relate to anything? Does this give the audience any more context about the story itself that they should have? Ask yourself these questions. And if you found yourself doubting, then probably don't mention it.
Yeah, and just going off of that, Nama, you mentioned something important there, which was it's always important to bring in those different voices. And that's very true. It's always something that we tell our CJRU volunteers is always do the work to bring in as many different voices and as many voices which are typically excluded from those types of stories, but be aware of when you might be virtue signaling. So you don't always need to make your audience aware of every single process that you took to get those diverse or misrepresented voices included in your piece. It is more than enough to just do the work quietly for yourself and for the betterment of your piece as a reporter. And then if someone were to ask you about it, you have evidence to show for it. But it's important to not just put yourself out there as, look, I'm the good reporter, because that can actually make it look a lot less genuine and a lot worse. So do the work for yourself, and because you want to be a better journalist and because you want to tell these stories, not because you want everyone to see you telling those stories. And Sam, I know you have kind of a lived experience with this, if you're interested to share.
Yes. Yeah, some more story time. So I mentioned earlier that I have been leaning into my kind of skills from the music world. And so to be more specific, I work as a DJ alongside this stuff I do with CJRU. And so my initial experience with press has been on the other side of this, sharing my story. And the kind of like phrasing like female DJ or like, I don't know, just gendered things, I guess, pop up more often than I would like. And I just wanted to talk about that. So I DJ, and then I also do run an initiative that addresses just addresses gender equity in music. So I am comfortable talking about gender and music and that whole kind of experience, but I don't want to talk about it every single like moment of my day and every single interview I do or anything like that, where I'm talking about like music and just everything under the sun besides gender. But then like the title will have like me being a female DJ, or it's like marketed in that way, things like that. So that I don't love. Shocking, I know. But when it does happen, I think I'm often frustrated. And also I'm now burdened with like educating these journalists around like why they should like change their title or whatever, it is that is bothering me, which I don't always do. I just kind of leave it and then I don't share it. And because I'm not like excited anymore. So I think that there's like lots of like consequences to it. And yeah, lots of reasons to kind of keep these things in mind as you put out stories and talk to people.
All right. And I guess the next thing is that we're going to talk about is using the right words. There's a very specific terminology that goes with each certain community. And we really have to give it some thought when we report on them, really into specific details. And I'm sure those of you that have gone to journalism before or have any sort of background know that there's a lot of online guides that we're often encouraged to use when it comes to, how to maybe describe someone's identity or how to refer to them. But I would say that those online guides shouldn't be your basis. The first thing, and this kind of really goes back to the point I made before, really the main thing you should do is simply ask. So, for example, just ask people how they want to be identified, because the guides are really far from enough. For example, I remember in my first year of J school, I remember our professor taught us that when we talk, for example, about people with disabilities, we should talk person first, so instead of saying a disabled person, we would say person with a disability. But then with a lot of conversations that I've had with people with the disabled community, a lot of them actually prefer disability first language and they don't like person first language. So if I went ahead and used some online guides that my first year professor sent me via email, I would have just misrepresented all of my sources, right? So you don't want to do that. You always just want to make sure to ask. And of course, these questions can be uncomfortable to ask. How should I describe your disability? Or how should I describe your ethnic background? It can feel awkward, especially when you're not a member of that community. But you have to understand that these are incredibly important questions to ask. And as a journalist, you have to ask them, right? So even if you read something from an online guide, don't simply assume that's how everyone wants to be referred to. Always ask and don't generalize. And again, members of the community will always appreciate you asking these questions, wanting to know, being curious, knowing, how can I represent you the best way that suits your identity and the way that you feel the most comfortable with. When you ask it that way, sources will always tend to appreciate it.
I'm just going to add to that. So yes, I follow, I guess, my lead, I follow the lead of my sources. And so a recent example, I think in the last few months, I've put out stories with phrasing like 2SLGB or 2SLGBT and LGBT plus, LGBTQQ, 2SIA. In different stories, I use one phrase for the length of the story, but that's an example, like what Nama was saying, that just because it's in a guide doesn't mean you have to use only that. And so the reason I have this variety is because I've been asking my sources, what's the phrasing that feels most comfortable for you and what your community, your specific community is used to seeing you with. And so I think it can change across your stories. And I had an even more recent example to share. I did an interview recently around healthcare in prisons. And so I had asked my source, do you want me to say prisoner or inmate? What kind of wording would you normally use? And I learned that the term prisoner and the way that she uses it is a very politicized word, recognizing the caging of people, the incarceration of people, whereas words like inmate, which is government, the words that are used in government documents, have more of that healthcare kind of where this person is receiving care kind of undertone. And it was great to know what wording she preferred, but I think since I was already doing a piece around healthcare in prisons, that just added a different layer to the story and it just made it stronger. So I think there's lots of great reasons to ask your sources why they use certain words or what they would want to be used. So yeah, that's another story for me. I feel like I have so many stories.
It's also very important to always understand the changes in language. I do a disability issue show, and the language is constantly fluent and changing, so what might have been an acceptable term in an interview 10 years ago would not be today, for example. Something I see a lot of. And also, further to Nama's point, sometimes if you're not part of a community, you can actually expatiate on how the world views a given culture or a given minority group, and just offering a perspective, interviewing somebody who's, say, able-bodied for the disability community, something I've done periodically just to see how the world views it. And if they have limited contact, what are the first thoughts going in? Actually, it's been an ongoing project of mine for almost the run of the show, and I've been doing the show now going on 13 years. But identity protection is also really key. I interviewed a woman a few years ago. It's one of my very proudest interviews. It was a transgendered person who had cerebral palsy. And her family had such bias against her, they decided to pull her out of college and deny her the transition surgery. And basically, she was just left to her own devices. And that is, I might add, the only time I ever got a request for someone to have their voice disguised on the air. And to this day, I've never told anyone where that story came from. But the fact is, it's those stories we need to be talking about more and more. Anybody can look at the big thing that's going on, Special Olympics, Paralympics, but if you look at how the athlete trains during the off season, you get a great story too. Just this morning, or rather late last night, I interviewed a Syrian refugee who was talking about what it's like being blind internationally and the supports there versus the supports here. So my experience in misrepresented communities is more reflecting something that's woven into the tapestry of all groups, really. What I found is disability has affected everybody everywhere. It's in every family, and statistical estimates that say it's 15% of the world's population, completely lowballing it, just so you know. There's potentially thousands out there that haven't been diagnosed, and those who just won't accept who and what they are in that sense. So I like to just give a more balanced story. When I studied journalism, I found that disability stories were presented in either the really inspirational way or the really bitter way. There was no middle ground. Look at a traditional sports page and tell me there's equal representation. You can find me one of those, the heart attack will get me, so just be prepared for that. And that's a little bit about me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Before we play your clip, can you just tell us quickly the name of your show and where we might be able to find it?
My show is called Handy Link. It's broadcast primarily out of CJAM 99.1 FM in Windsor, Detroit, but it is on the NCRA program exchange as well. And on average, it's carried by 7 or 8 stations a week, my record being 16 when I covered a story about how it's legal in the United States to pay workers with disabilities below minimum wage and the dehumanizing effect it has on them.
All right, sounds like a great show, and I'd encourage everyone to go check it out. And now let's hear Ken's advice.
Hello, my name is Cameron Wells. I'm the host of the syndicated disability issues radio program Handy Link. I was asked to share a little bit about why it's important to report on marginalized or underrepresented groups, my area being the disability group. I can tell you there's no single answer to this. Everyone has a different perspective on what a disability is and what it means. The truth is, when you give a voice to the voiceless, it's good for you because you're sharing a great story as a journalist. But to them, you're opening doors. You're brightening their lives. Maybe for the very first time, you're giving them that moment where they recognize their life has value, their story has value. And honestly, as a reporting area, it's an endless tapestry. For the truth is, anyone can look at what's immediately happening in a large-scale disability event, but if you look at the follow-up or the prep work that goes into it, the long-term impact on the community, there's a million great stories to be had out there, folks. Inclusion is not an afterthought. We shouldn't report on these stories because we feel obligated, because we feel that it's in our best interests to be politically correct. We should report on things like disabilities athletics, because it's a great game. It's an intense sport. These athletes train hard. They put on a great show that thrill the audiences. And beyond that, there is not a family or group out there that hasn't been impacted by disabilities, women's issues, cultural issues. These matters touch us all in some ways. It's in our family history. It's in the makeup of who and what we are. So, to honor these stories, we're honoring a global community. We're saying our ideals and our actions matter. What we're reporting on is that of substance, and it is not simply an obligation to be checked off a list.
I guess now we're going to move on to our next topic, which is how do you report on marginalized communities without pushing so many harmful stereotypes that already exist about them? So oftentimes when people talk about issues that affects a certain community, a lot of closed-minded people automatically tend to assume that those issues are that community's fault. And it's just a very terrible narrative that even exists today. And so many stories that we see, whether it's independent incidents or even investigative stories sometimes, really only touch up on the tip of the iceberg, the present day issues that happen within a community without addressing the real cause of it. So then people are left to come up with their own conclusions. So in order to get rid of this flawed narrative that so many issues that go through, the Black community, the Indigenous community are their fault, never report about issues without mentioning their actual cause and historical context. So, for example, when it comes to dangerous neighborhoods, many people tend to blame that quote unquote ghetto phenomenon on people of color, particularly the Black community, whenever we hear about instances of crime and so-called in those neighborhoods. But if you actually take a good look into history, it'll show you that a lot of these issues that exist today are actually a direct result of segregation laws and housing discrimination that was perpetuated by white people. And the same applies to so many issues that affect other communities, like the queer community and Indigenous communities to this day in Canada. So if you don't talk about these things without some context into their real cause, when you talk about these issues, people will make their own flawed assumption. So really make sure it's not just enough to interview people with what's happening in present day. Take a look back down on history lane, really trace the cause. Ask yourself why. And that is such an important question, because if you don't answer the why in your stories, people will make their own conclusions. So just always keep that in mind.
Like Nama said, it's a lot about the narrative that you put out when you report on a misrepresented community. And it's a lot about the way that you present that community. And you just want to recognize that not every story about a historically misrepresented group has to be sad. It's definitely important as a journalist to report on when things are going wrong and to flag problems so that they can be solved. That's called doing your due diligence. But that also involves avoiding things like trauma porn, which, if you've never heard that term before, refers to when people will report consistently on trauma, on instances of trauma, and they will do so in a way that allows them to capitalize off of it. Usually it's very frequent reporting on those types of topics. Remember, you also want to report on great things going on with the community, things like local initiatives to help combat the issues that you're talking about, so that you aren't presenting a one-sided narrative of this community. And more importantly, you're not presenting them as completely helpless in their own existence, because that's not the case. And just lastly, while you do hold some power regarding the way that you present people's narratives to your audience, I wouldn't allow that to get to your head. I tend to think the phrase giving a voice to the voiceless or telling a person's story is a very common thing to think of, but I tend to stay away from it. And the reason I do that is because it's not my job to give someone a voice, to give someone a story. It's my job to step back and to give someone a space to tell me whatever they want to tell me, whatever is true for them. When we go in with an agenda of what we're talking about with a misrepresented community, it's really easy to present that community in the way that you see them. And that might include a lot of unconscious bias on your end. So instead, think about it as you just stepping back and allowing the person to speak with you authentically. That's the main thing that we say at CJRU, is just be authentic to what's actually going on. We also have some tips for you in terms of authenticity and building trust with a source. For example, at CJRU, it's our policy to not show rough drafts of interviews, of stories, anything like that to our sources. But when we work with misrepresented communities especially, it is crucial to be extra diligent with your fact checking. You want to make sure that you've quoted people accurately and that their story is coming across the way that it's intended to. In those cases, you might want to read those quotes to your source just to ensure you've gotten everything right, which not only makes for a more sound story because you're verifying it, but it also helps you build a better relationship with that source. Similarly, while you're not supposed to send full lists of questions in advance of interviews, it's all right to share some general topics and make people feel more comfortable. Things like, I'm looking to speak with you about this event or this trend or this situation, which are not really specific enough for someone to guess your entire list of questions and prepare for the interview in a way that would make it inauthentic, but are still ways of building trust. To help me explain this to you is Adrian Ma. So Adrian is one of the professors at the Ryerson School of Journalism. He is the host of he's the host of a podcast as well, and he works really well with Ryerson students. He is known for making his classes a safe space. He's also an author, similarly to how Kamal was an author. So he has lots of experience reporting on all different types of people and communities and working with people from all walks of life. So I think he's the perfect person to share this piece of advice with you.
Hey, thank you so much for reaching out to me for my thoughts on reporting on misrepresented communities. I know a lot of great ideas have been and will be shared. something that's been on my mind more has been figuring out ways to give sources a little more agency over the stories that they share while still doing the work of a journalist. I know that Melissa Sanchez from ProPublica has talked about sometimes calling sources that could be particularly vulnerable before she publishes the story, just to go over the framework of the piece and to read them back their quotes with the context. It's not necessarily about getting permission from the source after the fact. Rather, it's about offering a chance for them to see how the information they shared is going to be used. We interview people in moments of real difficulty, tragedy, anger, and despair, and it's sometimes important to give these people some time to consider the effects of their words, if they really meant the way they said it in the heat of the moment, and especially if they have very little experience in dealing with the media and the potential ramifications of it. So whether or not anything changes, I can see how sources would appreciate that opportunity and could lead to stronger relationships and more trust.
So a big issue that I think that comes around when you're trying to report on misrepresented communities and report on some of the communities that we're talking about tonight, I think there is an importance in kind of differentiating between ideas of objectivity and accuracy and fairness, especially between fairness and objectivity, which is kind of what I'm mainly going to be focusing on. So I think for me, because of course, I'm sure most of you know what objectivity means. In journalism, it's very much a sort of ideal that is kind of asked of reporters, is to kind of try to approach stories in an objective way where you're not going in any political direction or any direction on one side or another. It's very, not subjective, of course. So I think for me, a big problem I have with this kind of idea of objectivity in the news and kind of our obsession with it, or the industry's obsession with it rather. A reporter who's approaching a story with fairness, I would say, is someone who would be treating your subjects with empathy, and that's as opposed to a reporter who might be attempting to fulfill a certain standard of objectivity. I think someone who is doing that is fooling themselves into feeling that they're capable of covering stories outside of themselves almost, and coming into stories with no preconceived notions or ideas or feelings about the subject matter, which of course we all are, because we aren't machines, right? We're all coming into these things with thoughts about what we're covering. And I think that that's not something that has to be seen as a negative. I think that's something that we can all kind of own and take ownership of and kind of celebrate almost. Because I think for when you're trying to be objective, or try to have objective coverage, that implies that we aren't able to engage in a real analysis of what the problems are that we're talking about in these stories, or who's causing them, what groups are causing them, what political decisions have led to these issues, and what some potential solutions could be. And if we aren't able to diagnose those problems and point to what their causes are, then we've failed as journalists, and we've failed in that process of getting information from our subjects to our audiences and our readers. So like I said, I think, yeah, we should take pride in our position as storytellers and as journalists, that instead of just recording events in a way of like a camera would, where there is no opinion, there is no emotion behind it, we can advocate for change, because at its core, I think that the best journalism is a form of activism in a sense, because you're documenting injustice, and that's something innately that powerful people who are perpetuating injustice don't want. And I think on top of that, because and I'm a journalism student, I don't know how many of you tuning in are journalism students, but very much from kind of the get-go, I do remember, and it's discussed, and it's not totally, it's not a dictatorship by any means, but objectivity is very much something that is drilled into students from, I feel like, from very early on. And standards of objectivity also, I think the problem with this is that there is no real standards of objectivity, right? Because a story that's objective is different for everyone that's writing it. It's different for every journalist and for every writer. So because of that, when most publishers and gatekeepers and editors in the industry are white and aren't necessarily reflective of our overall communities in Canada and overall, then that means that standards of objectivity, are often incredibly different for white and for racialized students and journalists. And I think that's kind of hard to imagine in, kind of tangible ways, like kind of wondering, oh, well, what does that look like? It does, and it's hard to kind of notice it because we're so used to reading the news in a certain way, and there's such a kind of specific language to the news that we read and that we consume. But there are like many tangible ways, and one of them is that, and this is, broadly across all of, a lot of kind of pieces of Canadian infrastructure and all these different kind of aspects of what makes up Canada. But for instance, when police put out a statement or speak in court, it's submitted as evidence, and it's seen as credible because a police officer said it or because a representative of the police said it, versus when anyone else makes a claim about facing violence at the hands of police, they are often kind of put up against, the onus is on them to prove it, whereas the police often rarely have to prove anything. At least in many of our ways we kind of cover these kinds of issues. And I think this kind of also speaks to a point that Nama made earlier in this presentation, that about using the right words. And I think there's an important part. I was actually reading something, I think yesterday, and it was talking about CP style, which is Canadian press style, which is kind of not every outlet in Canada uses it, but many do. And it's kind of the universal language that newspapers and different publications use. And a lot of the time when there's a shooting where a police officer has shot and killed someone, the language oftentimes used is officer involved shooting. And I think that kind of speaks to, again, like what Nama said, but also I think it's a kind of indicative of how a lot of the time in the industry, we're afraid for whatever reason about using direct language and calling something what it is. And that is just one example. And it's kind of a workaround language where you don't have to say that a cop shot and killed somebody. You can say it was an officer involved shooting. Whether there's justification for it, that's an officer involved shooting is taking the onus off of the officer for doing that, whether you think it's justified or not. That's not what happened. And you can even look back I guess almost over the past year. And you can look at coverage of unceded territories in Canada, and the media repeatedly using words like standoff or conflict or a clash between protesters and police. And while yes, that is objective coverage, it's something where you're giving sort of false equal weight to two claims, because it's not accurate, because unceded land that is unceded through treaties and through law, it does not belong to the federal government, is being illegally seized without consultation, which is in reality what it is. But of course, objectively, that's not how you would report it. And there's a lot of examples like this, and you could think about how the media uses language like racially charged or racially motivated when describing incidences of violence directed, of racist violence directed towards different communities. So I think just to kind of cap it off, I know I've been maybe speaking for a while, and I want to get to everyone else because you're all very intelligent, and I want to hear what everyone else has to teach me because I am still learning. But I think just to kind of cap off, when it comes to covering misrepresented communities and how this kind of idea of objectivity and fairness and these things kind of tie in, I feel like objectivity is often treated as a way for journalists to abdicate responsibility in the ways that violence is perpetrated against these communities, and maybe the roles that we play in letting those things happen. And I think that just to kind of leave it off, to think about is that we can't come into situations pretending that we aren't people, and we shouldn't want to. And that's not something that that shouldn't be your goal, to come into a situation thinking that you can come into it with no thoughts. And as long as, I think, as you are declaring your biases and you are aware of them and kind of picking at what those are and learning about those, then I think there is no problem with coming into things with empathy and with all these things, and not trying to just come at it from just a reporter's perspective where you don't care about what the outcome is. And to kind of segue into the next slide, like I said, I am still learning these things. So yes, and I think Sophia has some things to say, I think if I have the right order, about what happens when you make mistakes, because that is something that's going to happen no matter who you are, especially when you're younger. You're going to make lots of mistakes doing these stories. And it's just talk about, I think, some of the ways that we can respond in healthy and constructive ways when that happens.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for all of that. I hope that was especially useful to those of you who have been taught time and time again about objectivity and what that means, and that it's something you should strive for. And for those of you who haven't considered it yet, I hope that gives you a lot to think about. Like Alex did say, we are still learning, especially for those of us who never grew up in a situation where we were misrepresented or marginalized in any way. It's a lifelong process of unlearning and relearning how to talk to people and about people who are not from the same experience as you. And with that, mistakes will happen. I think we all have a story of when we've done something that, looking back on where we are now as reporters, we wish we'd never would have done, or we said something that still keeps us up at night about how we could have said that to someone. And that sort of thing does happen. But when it happens, you want to control the way that you handle it and how you move forward, because that says a lot about how you are as a reporter. So first of all, I would suggest that you take a second and really sit with what was said to you. Consider the person's perspective fully as you can. It can be easy to take criticism or being called out as a personal attack, especially when your intentions were never to hurt the person, or when you feel like you tried your very best to tell that person's story as accurately and fairly as possible, and you feel like you got something wrong. But remember that any source would have trusted you with their story, and they have the right to tell you if you got something wrong. So sit with it. Even if it wasn't your intention to hurt the source, it still happens. And the first thing that you want to do is accept that responsibility within yourself. After that, apologize. Start by apologizing directly to the person you've hurt, because they may be the one who brought it to your attention. Let them know that you do take the time appreciate them, taking the time to help educate you on that. That's not something that they have to do, and they're doing it because they care about you and they want you to be a better reporter in the future. So thank them for their efforts in that way, and tell them that you are taking their words seriously, and then prove that you're taking their words seriously by speaking with your producer at CJRU, your editor, anywhere else, anyone who you worked with on the project, about the steps to issue a correction to that story or amend the work in some way to be more reflective of the person's thoughts, if they were justified in those thoughts. After that, you want to let the audience know. So when there is an error in the story, the last thing you want to do is sweep it under the rug. You want to be transparent with your audience. You owe that to them. So let them know that there was an error, apologize to them as well. People from your audience may be part of that community and may be feeling hurt even if they don't express it to you directly. So apologize, let the audience know that there was an error, and then let them know that the story has now been corrected, and direct them instead to the corrected version of the story. You might also consider reaching out to people in your life who are a part of that community and just let them know what happened as well, and be honest and upfront with them about it. It might be easy for them to see all that's happening and think of you as less of a trusted or safe person for them. And if that's someone that you care about in your life, you definitely don't want that to be the case. So it might be worthwhile to reach out to those people and just let them know what's going on and what you're going to do next. And speaking of what you're going to do next, the last thing that I would suggest that you do is put your words into action and take those additional steps. If you're able to financially give to an organization that is helping out that community, otherwise, you do what you can. So if it's possible, volunteer with an organization who's doing work in that community, sign up for some sort of workshop or class to learn how to be anti-oppressive, ideally from people within that community themselves. And anything like that could help. And I know, Sam, you also have some ideas on what this can look like.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about acts of solidarity as journalists. And I think that's something that definitely applies in what Sophia just mentioned around, what happens next when you make a mistake, but also just in our kind of initial conversation around whether a story is for you. So I don't think it's, you write the story and you did the thing, or you don't write the story and you do nothing. I think there's lots more that can happen. And when I think of like acts of solidarity for journalists in particular, I think that we can really leverage our connections in the industry to help bring attention to a movement, a story, whatever it is. And that can be a specific way that we can offer something that not, a lot of people can do. So it might be just passing on a press release, or just, chatting as you chat with other journalists, just putting things on their radar, and making those connections. So I think definitely things to consider alongside like donating, volunteering, and all of those pieces. And then also just in general, there's lots that we can do to move movements forward and just be an active member in it and offer something productive. So yeah, just something to think about as you hear stories and things like that.
How do you find reporting on misrepresented communities within an on-campus publication? So I'll take a quick stab at this and then I'll pass it to the other hosts. The important distinction with CJRU as opposed to what would be considered campus media is that we are not just campus media. We have a distinction that's very specific to the NCRA, which is the National Campus Radio Association, and that's a campus and community distinction. So we report on, yes, things happening on campus, but we also take that further and report on the Toronto community, on the GTA community, and sometimes Canada-wide. So it is a balance, but it's not just about tying it back to campus. It's about tying it back to the greater population, if you will. Anyone else on the hosting team want to take a stab at the question?
I wanted to mention when it comes to like some like a platform or an outlet like CJRU, I think for communities that are hesitant with media, I think being a campus and community radio station is a good like stepping stone, because just the nature of that place is usually a bit more trustworthy on the scale of like media outlets, I would say. So I think that's helped me in the kind of stories I've been doing so far, to just be like, hey, I'm at Ryerson. This is like my vibe, some past stories. Yeah, because I think that kind of brand association can help and hurt in like the conversation of trusting media. So I just thought I feel like I've had a good experience being at CJRU. And the stories I've been able to cover have been like, the fact that I'm at CJRU makes a difference in a lot of different ways, but definitely even just the context of being on campus.
Again, like the campus, look at it like a representation of Toronto almost. I mean, I'm talking about Ryerson specifically here, but whichever campus you may be on, look at it as a representation of your city and make sure that you act that way. And I guess I'm going to address the second question by Cam to the chat of have you ever decided ethically you simply could not share an interview as it further marginalized a group? I can talk about this vaguely just because of the nature of this question. I wouldn't want to disclose a certain thing. But yeah, I have had an interview in the past with a member of a marginalized community, and I was trying to collect as much information about them as possible, about their life. And certain facts have come up that could have really like encouraged stereotypes that just didn't exist about that person. But if you talked about solely, those qualities, it would. And I found that while it would have been, I wouldn't want to say useful thing to know, but while it is a thing to know, at the end of the day, I had to make that kind of editorial decision within myself of this has nothing to do with the story. I only got this fact because I was trying to obtain more very highly personal information about this person. So this really shouldn't be a part of the story. It doesn't contribute to what the core of my story is in any way. So why would I potentially publish information that could, push stereotypes that really shouldn't be there about that person? So again, it's really like, it's kind of similar to that discussion we had before with when do you include someone's identity in a story? If does it actually have to do anything to do with the story itself? I guess the same thing would have to be with any like potentially like personal information you get about someone. right? When it's very personal, intimate information, think to yourself, does it actually contribute to the story, or is this just like gossip and help spice it up, I guess? Ask yourself that question, because you don't want gossip, right? You want to put journalism. Very big difference. So really ask yourself, what does it contribute to the story at hand?
As a journalist, the question of ethics and what I'll put on the air has come up a lot over the years, and only twice have I ever outright had to refuse to put a story on. The first was a doctor who said any woman not pregnant by 25 should freeze her eggs, and well, that's medically unprovable, so I wasn't going to do it. The second was someone who outright, no matter what goes wrong in the world, blames his disability. I will never put on the air anyone who will marginalize or set back perspectives on a group that's already dealing with it. And actually, side note, I've developed a course on accessibility for Canterbury College that I've been teaching on and off, and one of the chapters does relate to what you can ethically cover without feeding into the myths surrounding disabilities. And well, a lot of the things you run across are really quite bizarre. In some places, you find disability is still regarded as a curse, and people will be removed from their own community. It's still a valid area to report on, mind you, but as a journalist, you have to ask, how do I want to frame this? Can I do it in a way that gets the story across, but does not encourage others to take the same action or to look down upon another's way of thinking?
It's hard because, of course, you always, I mean, at least in my case, it's very easy to kind of go down that rabbit hole of looking at negative comments and stuff that are harmful or potentially ignorant or, potentially violent, depending on who you are. And it's very easy to fall into those rabbit holes where you just kind of get upset. I'm writing I'm on masthead for the Review of Journalism, which is a magazine that's published through the School of Journalism at Ryerson. And temporarily, just as kind of a design change, the class that I'm a part of for this magazine, we removed the name Ryerson. The title for the magazine officially is Ryerson Review of Journalism. Just for this semester, as we are the masthead running it temporarily until the summer, we removed Ryerson from the title of the magazine. And we did that because there's two, separate processes going on, and especially after all of the protests and all the actions that were going on last summer, people were once again talking about how Egerton Ryerson, who, for anyone who doesn't know, who founded Ryerson University, was a key architect. He was a key mind behind creating residential schools, considered by the UN to be like a way of perpetuating cultural genocide against Indigenous people. And so there's been lots of talks about removing Ryerson's name from the school or changing the school's name, or whether that makes sense, and all these things. But we just decided, kind of as an aesthetic choice, to remove Ryerson, and we put out a statement about it. And we explained all of this, that it was just a temporary thing. And people were so upset on Twitter. It wasn't like a huge thing by any means, but and I totally fell into that, and where you kind of start reading negative comments, and it's people who either don't understand what you're saying or are actively angry about it. And whether you disagree with it or not, whether you disagree with our decision, that's one thing, and I think that's fine. But it's people who are insulting and making really, kind of obscene comments about people who are like, we're not teenagers, but we're, most of us are in our like early 20s at the oldest. We're all like young aspiring journalists. We're all just kind of getting into the industry, most of us at least. And yeah, it can be really kind of demoralizing, I think, when you're kind of a younger person, or you're in that position, and people on Twitter who just don't have that connection. So, I mean, for me personally, I don't know if I really have any advice. For me, it is just kind of having a solid group of people who are with you and kind of can back you up when you make those decisions. And most of the time not reading it. And also I recognize that, there's difference for me as like a cis white man, that there's a difference between some of the messages I may get or some of the insults that might be directed my way potentially versus someone who is, you know, from a different identity. But I think it is important to, oh, yes, thank you, Alyssa. Ryerson is named after Ryerson, but was not technically founded by him. Yes, thank you. But anyway, yeah, so I think it's important to just have kind of a stable base and have people that you can go back to who are part of your organization and talk to, which I'm sure Sean can, you know, speak to a bit more. But I just want to say I hear you, and that has, you know, that's something that recently happened to me, and it is very frustrating. And I think it is something where, yeah, you have to kind of be able to, unfortunately, you kind of just have to ignore it, because as long as it's kind of something that isn't something as kind of unmonitored as social media in many ways, that it is just sort of something that people are going to take advantage of. And I think, yeah, and I mean, Sean, you can probably speak more to kind of some of the logistics of how you respond to those things. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to say that.
Being that radio doesn't really have a comment section, we do take complaints very seriously, and we'll respond to them according to a policy as well. And so I think perhaps Alyssa would be best to ask. I haven't dealt with anything regarding social media, but we have had a complaint within my rather short time here at the station, and we had to make adjustments. We had to communicate with our volunteers as well to make sure that our policies were clear. And we also took with a grain of salt what the complainant was saying as well, to do our own investigation and be sure that the complaints were valid as well. So we will, I mean, there's in some ways a delicate balancing point of protecting your reporters, for instance, but also making sure that change is made when it's necessary. And I would typically say, what does the policy say? And that would be hopefully the safeguard against any kind of backlash, whether it's comments or otherwise. So
we do have a social media policy. We also just updated our website, and we specifically do not have a comment section because I have, well, this isn't the exact reason, but I have never seen an important exchange happen in the comment section on a news story. I've generally seen some not great things. So, but we do have a social media policy, and we sort of expect people to act respectfully. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe, I'm sure there's been good stuff, but yeah, it's generally that's sort of how we go about it. We follow our policy in terms of engaging online. I think that we've had really good engagements though. So one of the nice things about having policy is when you don't have to use it super often. So I'm kind of a little rusty on it because we've had really good interactions with people of late.
As I mentioned at the very beginning, when I produced the radio show Femme Radio, I was a very new journalist. I was still in my first year of journalism school. I had never done anything like that before. I barely spoke to people outside of my friend group. So when you asked me how to talk to people who weren't people that I knew well, or people who didn't have the same story to tell that I would, I was kind of lost. So I, like I said, was doing my best, and it was a lot of learning and as I go. And I remember one time I got a call from someone who I now love dearly, but someone who didn't like something that I had broadcast. And this person meant a lot, their opinion meant a lot to me because they were one of the people who started up the show. So it was really important to me that they liked it because I wanted it to be true to their vision. I was just carrying it on. Femme Radio is a long-running show at CJRU. So that was tough because that was when someone was telling me, you know, I know that you're trying, but you're not doing enough. And that was something that I really had to work through. So I would say you want to try your best to, you know, it's okay to be hurt. It's okay to think about those things. But when someone is giving you a criticism that is valid and their delivery is good, or even if their delivery isn't good, it's just really important to consider what they're saying, look at your reporting and think, am I doing this? Be honest with myself, and then how am I going to move forward? And if you decide that there is no base for that claim, which has happened to me as well, then there's no base for that claim, and then you just move on. But it's important to be constantly holding yourself to account when possible, even if it's difficult.
You're not going to get everyone to agree with or necessarily like everything you're going to say, but if you leave them thinking about it and looking at these issues from a different angle, you've done your job. I mean, you're not there necessarily to placate everyone's political view. You're more there to inform and to educate.
I think as everyone's chatting, I was thinking that I guess it comes back to like that kind of, responsibility to the listeners, the readers that Cam had mentioned, and the responsibilities of journalism, but also like making sure they're like cared for almost. I don't know if that's like the right phrase to use, but just I think like if it's harmful kind of discussion or like maybe triggering, I think disabling feels like a fair kind of decision to make in those kind of scenarios. Because is that really like, what's that?
Is it valid versus is it just bashing?
Yeah, like if it's not the informing or educating piece, what is it there for?
It's not often you hear of people actually taking the time to say, these issues are real and we need to take a closer look. It's so easy as journalists just to look at the popular or the latest celebrity scandal or what have you, but we have to be better than that as reporters and even as people. What I always say is my disability, for example, is not a hat I take off at night. To a reporter, it's a story. To me, it's a life.